We have the labor demand equation because the slope is negative. So this is labor demand here. Labor supply because its slope is positive. So this is labor supply. This models worker behavior, and this models firm behavior. The labor supply curve slopes up because generally people will work more when the wage goes up. This models worker behavior because workers supply their labor and will supply more of it as the wage rises. This model firm behavior because as the wage rises, firms will hire fewer and fewer employees. In other words, as wage rises, firms will demand fewer and fewer workers. I've copied and pasted these equations into an Excel spreadsheet. And we'll compute the equilibrium employment level, the equilibrium wage, worker surplus, firm surplus, and total surplus in that spreadsheet. So that is my labor demand curve. This is my labor supply curve. To find the equilibrium employment level, I set demand equal to supply. Here I have the demand curve equal to the supply curve. Then I subtract 3.7 from both sides of the equation and add 0.019e to both sides of the equation down here. I factor out e on the right hand side of this equation down here, and then I divide both sides of this equation by this coefficient of e. So I calculate this value here, down here in cell B14. And I get an employment level of 744.068. I'm going to copy and paste that into Cengage now. I only need 2 decimal places, so since that third decimal place is a 7, the second one is a 7 when I round to 2 decimal places. This is the diagram I copied in from Cengage now. And you can see when employment is 744.068, demand and supply of labor intersect. And the wage rate is somewhere between 32 and 34. To get the wage rate, I substitute the employment level into the demand curve. And when I do that, I get a wage rate of 33.4627 to 2 decimal places, 33.46. I can double check that I did my work correctly by plugging the employment level in at the equilibrium into the supply curve. And I get the same value to 2 decimal places. Worker surplus is found by calculating the area of the triangle that is from this part of the labor supply curve up to the equilibrium wage and then back over the equilibrium. Why is that? Well, the first worker hired would be willing to work for this wage, but is getting paid this amount. So that worker has a lot of surplus. The 600 worker hired has a reservation wage equal to that value, but is being paid that wage. So you can see worker surplus is declining as the firm hires more and more workers. To calculate the area of this triangle, the base of the triangle is from the equilibrium wage to the intercept of supply. So B17 is the equilibrium wage, that height. 3.7 is this value, the intercept of supply. And then we multiply that by the height of the triangle, which is the equilibrium quantity. We divide that product by 2. And we get a worker surplus of $11,072.74. Since the labor demand curve represents firm behavior, this triangle up here, up to the demand curve, is producer surplus. Why is that? Well, when the firm hires the first worker, it is willing to pay up to that amount to that first worker, but only has to pay that value. For the 400th worker hired, their firm would be willing to pay that 400th worker that wage, but only has to pay that value. So you can see the producer surplus is declining as more and more workers are hired by the firm. To calculate that area, we take the intercept of demand, which is 47.6, subtract off the equilibrium wage, which is 33.46. We take that difference and we multiply that by the height of the triangle, the equilibrium quantity of employment, and then divide by 2, and we get a producer surplus of $5,259.55. Total surplus is just the sum of these two. So total surplus is this huge triangle, which equals $16,332.29. If a union forms in this labor market, it will be the only supplier of labor, which will make it a monopoly. If the union can't estimate labor demand, it can be shown that its marginal revenue curve has the same intercept as the labor demand curve, but is twice as steep as labor demand. Thus, the union's marginal revenue curve is, that is the labor demand equation. The marginal revenue of the union has the same intercept, but the slope is twice as big. So 0.038 is the slope of marginal revenue, and 47.6 is the intercept of marginal revenue. In the competitive equilibrium, the employment level is determined by the intersection of demand and supply. When the union monopolizes labor, the employment level is determined by the marginal revenue for the union and labor supply. I've copied and pasted this diagram along with the equations into Excel. This diagram comes from Cengage Now, as I mentioned previously. The competitive equilibrium is where demand and supply meet. The level of employment that occurs when a union monopolizes labor, that's determined where the marginal revenue of the union intersects labor supply. To determine this point, we have to set labor supply equal to the marginal revenue of the union. Then we subtract 3.7 from both sides and add 0.038 to both sides. Then we factor the E out, employment level, and we divide both sides of this equation up here by this coefficient of E, the value inside the parentheses down here. So the employment level is 562.82, which is this value right here. I'm going to copy and paste that into Cengage Now. At this level of employment, the labor union can charge up to the labor demand curve, which looks like the wage the union can get from the firm is between $30 and $40. So we plug the employment level we just found into the labor demand equation. We do that right here. And we get a union wage of $36.91. We're going to copy that and paste that into Cengage Now. Worker surplus is the trapezoid that is traced out by the labor supply equation up to labor demand and then over to the vertical axis. In order to calculate the area of that trapezoid, we need to average this height with this height, and then multiply that by the employment level of the union. To get this height, we just take the difference of the wage, which is calculated, 36.91, and the intercept of labor supply, 3.7. And we average that height, like I said, with this height. Well, in order to get this height, we have to plug this value into the labor supply equation. When we plug the employment level of the unionized labor market here, we multiply 562.82 by the labor supply slope and then add that product to the intercept. And we get a height of 2621. The value in the shaded box is the average of this height and that height. The first height is the wage of the union minus the intercept of labor supply. This height over here is the difference in the wage the union just negotiated from the firm and this height, 2621. So we average those two heights and then we multiply that by the employment level of the union. And we get a worker surplus of 12,353.91. I'm going to copy and paste that into Cengage now. Firm surplus is the triangle that corresponds to the wage negotiated with the union, labor demand, and then the vertical axis. We need to calculate the area of this triangle here. The height of this triangle is the intercept of labor demand, 47.6, minus the wage the union and firm agreed to, 36.91. That value right there. And we multiply that by the employment level and divide by 2, and we get a firm surplus of $3,009.29. I'm going to copy and paste that into Cengage now. Total surplus is the sum of worker surplus and firm surplus, 15,363.2. The union reduces employment by 181.25. The union raises the wage, the increase being the difference in these two wages, 36.91 and 33.46, by $3.44. Deadweight loss is this triangle here. To calculate the deadweight loss, I take the difference in these two heights, the difference of 36.91 and 26.21. Multiply that by the difference in these two values, 744.07 at the competitive equilibrium and 562.82 at the monopolized value of employment. After I multiply those two values, I divide by 2 and I get a deadweight loss of $969.09. After I copy and paste that value back into Cengage now, and then check my work, I should get everything correct. And it looks like I do.